I'm Cherylanne Skolnicki, and this is Brilliant Balance, the show for working women who are ready to shine. Each week, I bring you ideas, inspiration, and insight on balance, business, and getting it all done gracefully. You ready? Let's be brilliant. This is episode 313 of the Brilliant Balance podcast. And today I'm talking about how to turn your setback into a comeback. So we're going to start this episode with a story. I was reflecting on a variety of different types of setbacks that people might experience as I was putting together my notes for this episode. And that list prompted a memory, one that I haven't thought about, honestly, in a really long time. And so I'm going to tell you the story about this memory and how I think it has shaped my experience with setbacks and with resilience in a way that I might not have thought about until this kind of came up for me. So important background is that I grew up on the Delaware River in eastern Pennsylvania, a small town kind of tucked right in at the river's edge. And our home was sat up at the top of an embankment, but overlooking the river. So in the winter of 1981, there were ice jams that started to form kind of above and below my town on the river, which were creating like a tenuous situation. What I remember was the town officials and, people that my dad knew were all watching very carefully to see what the river was going to do. And they kind of kept going down to the river's edge, and people were in like pickup trucks and wandering around in, big winter coats with flashlights sort of down by the edge of the river, wondering what was going to happen. And what happened was that night, the water rose like 8.5 feet in an hour. And it happened in the middle of the night very quickly. And as this was happening, as the water was coming up, we had to evacuate our home. Now, as a 6-year-old, what I remember most about this, like from firsthand recollection, was that I was so excited that we got to go to my best friend's house because she lived at the top of the hill, sort of same little neighborhood that I lived in, but we were down at the bottom of this hill and she was at the top. And a number of different neighbors evacuated to her home because it was on higher ground. So what I remember was making like s'mores in the fireplace and popcorn in these really old school Jiffy Pop poppers that we could do like in the fireplace, and being so excited that we were having this massive sleepover, blissfully unaware of what was happening back down by the river. And what happened that day was that all the homes that were right along the river's edge and businesses flooded. There were, I went back and looked this up, there were 525 homes in this very small town that flooded. And the images are seared in my memory, partly because my dad took pictures of it. I was taken to see a little of it. It was in the newspapers. There were these ice chunks like the size of small vehicles, refrigerator-sized ice chunks in people's living rooms, in their bedrooms, on their front porches, because they came up out of the river and just crashed through into people's homes. And so there was a rebuilding effort that followed that event. And this was not a Hurricane Katrina scale of disaster, right? So when I think about other natural disasters that I have watched unfold since then, and where we've sent relief efforts or where people have gone in, every day we hear stories about massive damage to one community or another around the world. But every time I hear one of those stories, what I think about was what it felt like to live in my little town when it happened to us. And I think about my dad getting in his truck day after day, week after week. I mean, it went on for a long time, going to help people clean up their homes and restore the town to order. So I went looking when I was thinking about this in putting the episode together for any newspaper archives. And I found this quote in a New York Times archive that described what was happening. So this town was in Pennsylvania, but right across the river from New York. And so this was close enough to New York City, I guess, to get coverage in that newspaper. And here's what the quote said. As residents pick through their soaked and muddied living rooms and kitchens and crushed cellar foundations in this old mill town, the cleanup and recovery is being fueled by a proud spirit of self-help and independence. Self-pity and despair are hard to find, and there's little talk of selling and moving to higher ground. The dominant mood is one of cooperation, everybody helping everybody else dig out and clean up. And man, that is just how I remember it. And maybe in some small way, it's this spirit, which my parents perfectly embodied, that helped solidify my own resilience. Because when setbacks came, and they most definitely have in my life, I called on that foundation of resilience, right? Where the dominant mood is one of cooperation and where self-pity and despair are hard to find. So setbacks come in lots of forms. They can happen to us like a catastrophe that affects lots of people at the same time, like the flood or a hurricane or the pandemic, honestly, which we all lived through. They can be self-inflicted, right? We can kind of take ourselves down in a blaze of glory. And doesn't really matter how they arrive, they're going to come. Think about things like a serious illness or an injury that has a long recovery period, right? Financial difficulties, maybe an investment that goes badly or an ill-timed investment. 2008, the real estate crisis, which a lot of people weathered as massive financial setback, right? The loss of a loved one, or particularly the loss of a child. Addiction in any form, and whether it's your own or someone close to you that you are walking through the deep waters of addiction with. I think relationship breakups or divorces constitute major setbacks in life, right? We can feel like the path that we were on is no longer the path that we are on, and that need to regroup is so strong. It could happen when we get fired or laid off, when we're caught in a corporate restructuring, or when we're in a bad fit, or even when we just get passed over for a promotion, or we have a project that we're leading that fails and it feels like the career trajectory that we're on is no longer viable, or even having a bad boss or navigating a work-related conflict can fit into this camp of a setback. And regardless of what the origin of it is or the type is, when the setback comes, and we have to take the steps to move toward a comeback, those steps are the same. So let's look at what those steps are that we want to walk ourselves through whenever we have acknowledged that we're experiencing a setback. And I think that's an important maybe pre-step, is acknowledging that that's what this is. Because we don't always have that level of self-awareness when it starts, do we? We're kind of like so caught up in the emotion and the infinite task list and the things that have to happen that we might not be using words like setback. We might be using words like crisis or disaster, if we have words at all, right? It can feel like the end of the world, at least the end of our world. And so classifying what's happening as a setback really is the first harbinger of our ability to recover. Because if we do that, if we're able to call it a setback and not a failure, we're immediately in that energy of, okay, there's something that comes after this, right? It's a temporary event versus the end of the road. Hi, it's Cherylanne. Thanks for listening. Did you know that the ideas I share on this show are things I also can help you implement? If you want me in your corner helping you find more time for what fills you up, go to brilliant-balance.com/schedule and sign up for a free exploratory call. Give yourself this time. You'll be so glad you did. So after that, when we've acknowledged it as a setback, the first step is to feel the feelings. I'm going to sound like a broken record around here this year, I feel like, to remind us all to feel our feelings. But the reality is that setbacks hurt. And if we ignore that fact long enough or often enough, the feelings don't go away. Instead, they take on a life of their own to the point where they can really overwhelm us. So taking the time to acknowledge the presence of the feelings, the disappointment, the sadness, the anger, the loneliness, that whatever it is that's coming up for us in this period of a setback, taking time to acknowledge the presence of those feelings and to really honor the reality of them, right? Just to give them space to be. They're a logical response in all likelihood to whatever is happening. That collection of feelings that we have is valid. And even if we don't like them, and even if we would love those feelings to exit stage left so that we can move on to the next part, if we skip over this piece of feeling them, acknowledging them, giving them some space, then they won't move through. And getting those feelings to move through is very, very important because this emotional part of our brain that goes first, the part that needs to feel those feelings, is going to block the logical part of our brain where we can start planning about how we're going to move forward, right? It'll just create like a big cloud or a big barrier around our ability to actually do the next thing. So we want to give them space so that we get that piece of our brain back online, which is actually going to enable us to move forward. Now, once we've done that, we've sort of earned the right to move on to the next piece of the process. And this is where we look for the lessons. We look for the lessons. Now, sometimes, in full disclosure, we did something that created this setback, and it's something that we wouldn't do again, right? We don't want to repeat our mistakes or keep taking the actions that maybe were born out of inexperience or thoughtlessness, right? Maybe we just were like, oh, I would not have done that again. That was a bad decision that got me into this place. That was a bad pattern of behavior. I'm going to be careful about the word bad here. It was an ill-advised pattern of behavior, right? It's certainly something that we wouldn't want to repeat. So there are times where the lessons that we want to learn are, why have I done this to myself? What drove the set of choices that I made that got me to this place? Maybe what feelings was I ignoring? Maybe what did I know but I didn't want to know? Maybe what actions did I take or not take that resulted in this particular setback happening? This is not in every setback. And very importantly, sometimes things fell apart through no fault of our own. And there are lessons there too. There are lessons in learning what we can survive. There are empathy lessons in learning what others have to survive when it is our turn, right? When we take our turn and we experience something, often we wake up and go, oh my gosh, people have been going through this in other households, in other places. And now it's my turn. And now I really get it. Now I understand what people are walking through, right? There may be lessons where we need to find acceptance, or lessons in forgiveness, or lessons in compassion. All the lessons count, right? Sometimes they're very practical lessons of, oh, I made this real estate investment and this is the factor that I missed. And because of that, it didn't go the way I wanted. But sometimes in a relationship or an illness or an accident, the lessons are not about finding fault. They're more about learning how we move through. So coming to terms with the setback with honesty, with humility, is a really important step in being able to move forward. What's the alternative? Well, if we're continuing to resist, and I call this fighting what is, right? If we're fighting what is, it's a gravity problem. This is the reality of the situation. And if we're resisting against it, then we can get stuck looking back instead of being able to look forward, right? It's where rumination is born. Resisting what is, just why did this have to happen? Why is this happening to me? Why now? All of those kinds of questions where this shouldn't be happening. I don't like that this is happening. There are emotions underneath that we want to address, but that cycle is one that we can get stuck in, and it can keep us kind of in a whirlpool instead of giving us the opportunity to start moving forward. So when we've taken the time that it takes to really sit with those emotions, maybe with some support, right? And we've taken the time to rebuild our strength emotionally, physically, mentally, right? When we've done some things to restore ourselves that maybe we couldn't do during the active phase of the setback. And when we've sought out the lessons that the setback had for us, then we can get up and begin again. And just like a stone in a slingshot, if you picture a slingshot and you're pulling it back, that stone sources speed and strength only by being pulled back. And we can do that too. We can use that setback to fuel our comeback. Which brings me to the third step, which is when we want to turn a setback into a comeback, we want to practice the habits of resilience. Now, this is really all about getting back up and trying again. right? It's that never say die, it's not over until it's over kind of attitude that allows us to keep going, to try again and again and again as many times as it takes to get the outcome that we want, right? It's what gives us the courage to take sometimes teeny tiny steps, almost invisible steps in the direction of what we want, and acknowledge that we are never out of options. We're never out of options. It's never the end. It's just the next step. It's the milestone. It's the place where we are on the journey. So when that flood happened back in my hometown, people didn't just say, well, I guess I don't have a home anymore, right? I guess I'll just pack it up and be homeless. Like what they said was, we're going to rebuild this, and that's going to take money, and it's going to take time, and it's going to be a giant mess, and I'm probably not going to like a lot of it. But if I want to have a life on the other side of this, I'm going to have to do that work. So whatever is falling apart, right? Whether it's a relationship, whether it's your finances, whether it's something in your home, whether it's something at work, whatever it is that's falling apart, that courage to try again, to kind of dust yourself off and pick yourself up and take the next step, that's the essence of the habits of resilience. Marianne Radmacher has this quote that I love that says, courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I will try again tomorrow. And that to me embodies resilience in such an important way, differently than kind of the take the next hill, charge forward. Sometimes when you're in a season of experiencing a setback, the most that you can muster are very tiny, careful steps forward, a quiet willingness to try again. So if you are in a season now where you're experiencing a setback, where you're really in the thick of it, I truly hope that this encourages you. I hope that it gives you a path forward. And if you're ready for your comeback, I will be right here in your corner cheering you on. That's all for today, my friends. Till next time, let's be brilliant.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.